Thank you. Hi, everyone. Thanks for the opportunity to present today. This is the first time I've actually presented this presentation to a Northern Australian audience, so quite relevant to everyone here in the room. This was something I presented last year in Coffs Harbour at the IAVS conference, so the International Association for Vegetation Science. So, yeah, it's great that I can present it to you today. So a number of other authors on here as well that contributed to this work are listed there. So this is a biome approach to plot-based vegetation classification in Northern Australia. So without further ado, there's the technicality of it.
Sorry. Yeah. No, it should work.
There we go. Okay, so just the agenda for today, a bit of background on why I'm doing this work and the rationale behind why we need a national vegetation typology, the study area, the methods, results, and then at the end I'm going to talk about a crosswalk to other international, national and state typologies, and then we'll look a little bit closely at Eucalyptus tetradonta vegetation type at the international scale. And then, of course, I'll finish off with future work. So a bit of background, vegetation classification and mapping. Australia's vegetation types are unique. So when we look at Australian flora, 85% of our flora is endemic to the continent. And this was reported in the Decadal Plan for Taxonomy and Systematics. So with 85% of our flora being endemic, the majority of our vegetation types are also endemic. So Australia has a long history of vegetation mapping, so dating right back to the early 1900s. So Ludwig was claimed to be the first vegetation map. So as you can see, very broad approach to mapping back then. And ever since then, we continue to have a very state and territory based mapping system in Australia. So for Queensland, for example, the regional ecosystem mapping has a typology of broad vegetation groups, the ecological vegetation types in Victoria, ecosystems of South Australia, they've had a different approach to their mapping, and BioNet, so the PCTs in New South Wales, TasVeg, so from forest to field mark in Tasmania, and of course, WA based on beard and a regional map from the Kimberley as well. And it's great to see Dom here and a lot of people from Flora and Fauna Division that are working on the RIEL program, which is the regional ecosystem land mapping for the Northern Territory. So it'll be great to align this work with that mapping program for the Territory. So as a result of this mapping being state and territory based, they're not directly comparable across state and territory boundaries. So we can see the map up here. This is a composite of all of the state and territory mapping data sets. So it looks a little bit like a patchwork quilt. So when we look at that further, look at the borders. So we've got the Northern Territory there, and things just don't seamlessly map across those state and territory borders. So this is due to dissimilar data collection methods. So really looking at standardising the way we collect data so that it's comparable at a national scale. And it's also due to a range of different classification systems being used. So back in 2001, the Land and Water Resource Audit recognised a need for a national vegetation map for Australia. And this is where this mapping at the top, this was the composite of those data sets. So they realised that they needed to make some improvements so that it looked like a seamless map for the continent. So what they did was develop the National Vegetation Information System. So it's a 6 hierarchical vegetation hierarchy, and to cut down those border effects, they created the major vegetation groups and subgroups. So these are really broad groups. You can see here, even with this new map, with the major vegetation groups, we still have that border effect here. So there's still lots of improvement to make. So a national vegetation typology, why do we need it? I think I've just showed you before why we need it, because though it doesn't map seamlessly across the borders, existing classification systems are heavily weighted on structure and dominant genera. So we don't really have that floristic component in our classification systems. There is a new approach to this, and that's using plot-based vegetation data that's hierarchical. A lot of our classification systems are based on, not entirely based on plot-based classifications. So there's this new eco-veg approach that was developed in the States. So there was quite a few people around the country that recognised a real need for this. And we all met in Launceston at ESA in 2019, just before COVID hit. And we ran a symposium on, the need for a classification at the national scale and a vegetation typology. So we recognised floristic plot-based typologies were lacking, and there was an increasing end uses listed here, but not limited to development assessment, offsets, cumulative impacts, mapping, monitoring, and the list goes on. So we developed this research chapter within the ESA, and we're quite an active group, but I'll give you a little bit more information on that right at the end of the presentation. So this group has been working on a number of Australian case studies towards developing a national vegetation typology and putting Australian vegetation types into an international context. So we published a number of papers in a special edition of Australian Journal of Botany, and one of those was some case studies using eucalyptus tetradonta woodlands as an example, and Trodia hummock grasslands as well. So that was the paper published in this special edition, and there's a number of other papers that were published as part of that. Another paper we published was for the Northern Territory. So the Northern Territory is the only jurisdiction where we've trialled this floristic plot-based classification. So we used all of the plot data that's available in the vegetation site database, which is the Northern Territory's corporate database. So we've got a few people here represented from that group, Bridie, and a few people online, I'm imagining. And we came up with these broad floristic groupings, and they fell out, in terms of climatic gradients. So the top end, and then the semi-arid, and then the arid zone. So it fell out really nicely. But that's another presentation in itself. This is just providing some background. Another really great publication was the poplar box woodlands in Eastern Australia, so Queensland, New South Wales. And because of the different classification systems that were used in those states, the poplar box woodlands, they're actually a threatened ecological vegetation type under the EPBC. But because the classifications are so different, it's really hard to assess that under the EPBC Act for that community. So let's get to the study area. So taking a biome approach to this floristic classification, we use the study area from the Fox et al., so the savanna mapping, which aligns with Australia's bioregions. And I'm sure all of you in the room are familiar with the bioregional framework. It has 89 large geographical distinct bioregions, and then hundreds of subregions based on climate, geology, landform. So it made sense to use that existing study area for tropical savannas. Then this was probably the most complex part of the study, and that was acquiring all the plot-based data from across the jurisdictions and curating the data as well before any of the analysis took place. So we downloaded the data from QBIS, from VSD, and we just clipped it to the Savannah bioregion. For WA, because they don't have a vegetation corporate plot database, we accessed this harmonised data from CSIRO, but we also looked at Danju. So Danju is something for WA that's a pilot for the biodiversity data repository, but at the time, this was all based on occurrence records. So we had to use the harmonised data set from CSIRO for that one. And of course, we used all of the TERN plot data as well. So for WA, we had about 400 plots. Northern Territory is really rich in plot-based data. We're really fortunate when we compare ourselves to other states. So 35,000 plots for the NT and nearly 4,000 for Queensland, and then nearly 200 plots from TERN. So we compiled all of those data sets together and then we curated the data. This was the biggest headache and took a long time. So in total, we had about 50,000 plots representing just under 6,000 species across the savanna. We based it on presence-absence data. So this is suggested for large-scale analysis. So rather than using quantitative cover data, we just use presence and absence. We use species so determinations at the genus or higher level were removed from the data set. This reduced, inflation of species. And plots with less than 5 species were removed as well to reduce noise. For subspecies and variants and alien species, we removed those as well, again, to reduce the noise. And species with less than 5 occurrence records were also removed. So we ended up with just under 40,000 plots, representing about 3,500 species. We subsampled the Northern Territory dataset because we had so many plots from the Northern Territory. So we had to resample it so it was equally weighted to the number of plots in Queensland. We removed outlier plots. Once we did our first run of the analysis, we removed the outliers. And so we ended up with 50,000 plots to begin with. We reduced it to 40,000. Then we reduced it again after subsampling the NT data set. And we arrived at about 6,000 plots for the tropical savanna. So the data analysis, because it's a very high-level analysis, and we're trying to create this classification at the macro group level. So this is the International Vegetation Classification Hierarchy. It's an 8-level hierarchy. Australian vegetation types have not been coded up into this international system. And that's what we're striving to do going forward. So we're placing our vegetation types into an international context. Australian vegetation types are coded up at these 3 higher levels, but not these 5 lower levels. So here we're trying to classify our broad groups into a macro group level. So we used PAST and R for cluster analysis. So we used k-means, which is probably the simplest clustering algorithm, and we also used UPGMA. We ran the k-means and then we reran it again with the UPGMA, and then we ran the data with the outlier plots removed. So we ran the k-means with just 4 clusters. So that was the optimal number of groups, which had the maximum separation between groups. And then we extracted the frequency of occurrence that had high group membership. So all of the authors involved in this classification or analysis reviewed the data based on frequency of occurrence and the spatial distribution of these 3 following groups. So 4 groups, 7 groups, and 20 groups. So our results with our first test created this horseshoe effect here. And this indicates high similarity between the groups. So number of groups was 20 and the number of plots was just over 8,000. And when we look at the histogram, we can see that over half the sites have very high similarity. So test 2, we ran the data. This is the run 3 of the results. You can see the histogram there that we've got quite good groupings that make sense. And then we've got another grouping here of 7, which is even tighter again, which you would imagine in this scenario. So when we look at the frequency of occurrence, you can see with the species composition here, I've highlighted the dominant species for that plot, for those sites. This is like a Queensland sort of dominant type, and then we've got group 2, WA, WA Northern Territory. Group 3 is our sort of Melaleuca. Group 4, which is sort of that semi-arid zone. And then the other 3 groups here, so the Eucalyptus leucofloya, another Melaleuca viriflora community, and then group 7, which sort of didn't make a great deal of sense. But when we look at this spatially, well, it does make sense, but you'll see what I mean in a minute. There wasn't enough, so group 7, there wasn't enough sites. So that's why it didn't make sense. We just need more sites. So looking at the spatial distribution of the 7 groups, you can see here that we have the Corymbia clarksoniana, which is a community only found in Queensland. Then spanning across the Northern Territory and WA, we've got the Miniata Tetradonta dichromafloya community, if we're all familiar with scientific names. This community, we don't actually have Eucalyptus miniata in Queensland. We have another species very similar to it. Then we've got the Melaleuca viriflora community, which spans right across Northern Australia there, which also makes, that was quite a tight community grouping. Corymbia terminalis, once again, that spans right across. Even though there's taxonomic issues within Corymbia terminalis, it still fell out as a really good macro, at that macro group level. And then the leucofloya, it came out for some, which surprised me, and that sort of spans that border there, Queensland Northern Territory border. And then we had another grouping of viriflora. This is sort of that community that fell out with Nosophila, so across Top End and Cape York. So you can see that these groups do make sense at the macro group level, but we do need to refine this analysis. These are just preliminary results. So other results, when we look at the 4 groups, you can see here on that cluster, it's quite a good, you know, tightness of clustering, and there's maximum separation between groups. And here you can see, once again, the species, Tetradonta miniata, just the Tetradonta dominant community, which is right across Northern Australia, terminalis, and the Melaleuca. And then as we refine the analysis, you'll actually get groups that will drop out below these larger groupings. So when we look at the spatial distribution of these groups, we've got Tetradonta miniata, Northern Territory WA, Tetradonta erythrote, right across Northern Australia there, Euterminalis Bohinia, so that covers that semi-arid zone, and then, of course, our Melaleuca community as well. So it does make sense using plot data. So now I'm going to show you how we can crosswalk this information to other typologies. So the international typology that I spoke about earlier is the IVC, and also the GET typology, the IUCN Global Ecosystem Typology that David Keith developed. Has anyone heard of the GET typology? Yeah, so there's been a formation review just recently, and they're just publishing a paper on it. So with GET, these higher levels here, so functional groups and biomes, they've all been developed. So if you jump onto that website, you'll be able to see all of these developed, and we're just talking about the terrestrial and the transitional realms here. So the IVC was just based on terrestrial realms, but now what they've done is they've included the terrestrial realms with your transitional realms with your freshwater. So they've sort of included your wetlands, which is good because that was lacking in the IVC. So now the IVC and the GET typology, they've brought them into alignment, which is great. and the lower levels of the GET typology have not been provided. So GET will be relying on these lower levels of the IVC to build these units in the GET typology. So that's all work that'll be happening down the track. So with IVC and GET, they're similar in hierarchy. They did have to do some adjustments to the current IVC for levels 1 and 2. So that's been done, but it just hasn't been published yet. Level 3 of the IVC and the GET, they mostly align well. So that's this formation group here and the functional groups. They aligned quite well. So there is potential to IVC to add depth to the GET. And this involves international collaboration. So there are some people in Australia that are collaborating with this project. Yeah, that's the formation revision I was talking about at those higher levels, and that's been completed now, but it just needs to be operationalised. So when we look at the national scale, we can actually crosswalk this to the major vegetation groups with NVIS. So here, so NVIS contains over 10,000 distinct vegetation types, but that's a result of all of the different mapping data sets that came in from the states. So they're not really 10,000 distinct vegetation types. So that's why they created the major vegetation groups and the subgroups. And this here is why we need a typology based on plot-based data. We can crosswalk it to the broad vegetation groups in Queensland and the vegetation types of Western Australia. So with Queensland, there's 35 broad vegetation groups. WA, there's 55 pure types, and then they have some mosaics as well. So let's have a look at Eucalyptus tetrodonta. I know we don't have any koalas here in Northern Australia, but it was a cute photo. So, so let's look at this group through a lens. So the Australian Darwin stringy bark, scleromorphic woodland, that's actually been coded up in the IVC. So here is the IVC and the GET. So here's our photo of the Eucalyptus tetrodonta woodland. We have the realm, terrestrial realm, the IVC. So it was called the shrub and herb vegetation. They've actually changed that to grassland, savanna and shrubland. That's been revised. Same here with the class. We now have a tropical grassland savanna, but that's been changed to tropical savanna. And in the GET typology, it's the savannas and grasslands biome. So when we look at the formation level here in the IVC and the level 3 in the GET typology, we have our pyrite tufted grasslands, and then we also have our hummock grasslands here, which are endemic to Australia. And at our division level and macro group level, our tetradonta woodlands fall out in this division, which we had to create a new division within the IVC. And our macro group that we've arrived at is here. So delving a little bit deeper and further down the hierarchy, we did an analysis of just Queensland and Northern Territory data for Eucalyptus tetrodonta, and we actually had to exclude these ones here. These ones here were excluded, so that was anything with the rusty-leaved bloodwood and a few other species like, you know, Darwin box and things like that. So the macro group is here for both Northern Territory and Queensland. And then at the group level, there was actually 2 groups that were split out. So one group was relevant to Queensland and another group was relevant to the Northern Territory. And then when we classify it at the alliance level, we have 4 groups. So we have 2 here, 2 here in the Northern Territory, and then 2 up there that are relevant for Queensland. So as you can see, we can just keep classifying the data, and all of this was based on quantitative data. So we didn't do that presence absence like we did at those higher levels of the hierarchy. We used the quantitative data to do that. So let's look at the macro group of the Darwin stringy bark. We can start crosswalking to the get typology. So the get typology includes ecosystem properties and ecological drivers too. So we're including that additional level of information. We can start to add the diagnostic species. So the floristics, the high frequency species that occur within that macro group. And then we can crosswalk it to existing typologies such as the major vegetation groups in NVIS here. So by adding plot data, we're adding that extra layer of confidence and validation to the classification system, rather than on an intuitive analysis that we've done, tend to do in the past. So New South Wales is a great example of their use of plot-based data. So with BioNet, if you go onto their website and download any of their mapping, part of that package, you actually download the plot data that has informed that map. And no other jurisdiction's doing that yet, but I think that's a really smart way to approach it, so people know what plot data has informed that, their PCPs. So future work. So with the work that I've just presented now for the tropical savanna, we do need to refine it. They're just preliminary results. We would like to add additional environmental layers to that classification, and run some additional tests as well. So as part of that as well, I think incorporating an expert elicitation into that analysis would really strengthen that too. So we're currently looking into ways of how to go about doing that. So it'd be great to hear from the room here if anyone's got any suggestions in formalising an expert elicitation with this type of work. So we'd like to keep building on a national listing of macro groups. So in the Northern Territory, the paper that we published, the analysis for the Northern Territory, we created recognised about 21 macro groups. And across that tropical savanna, it's still questionable how many groups until we've done that final analysis. So we have been engaging with the IBC and the IUCN GET formation review process to make sure that Australian vegetation types align with that classification system at the international level. We've been collaborating with NVIS. So NVIS, the National Vegetation Information System, has a technical working group and they're currently undergoing a review. They're road mapping what that's going to look like, and they are looking at using plot-based data to inform the future data sets of NVIS. So that's all happening as well. And they're also considering, using this whole approach and coding up Australian vegetation types with the IBC. So I guess the next thing too, once we've done this biome approach for the tropical savanna as a good sort of pilot, is to classify types from other biomes, such as, your deserts, temperate grasslands. So we've got a few experts in these areas that are keen to take on this work, but it does need to be supported and funded, resourced adequately. One of the limitations is having access to vegetation plot data. We don't have a national plot data repository for Australia. And all of the plot data is, available through state and territory corporate systems, and a lot of the time they're not comparable. But there is a solution. TERN has been working on EcoPlots platform. They're constantly trying to improve it, especially the download capabilities. It has a plot ontology and controlled vocabularies. So when you're downloading data sets from there, they are comparable. So there are a number of data sets in that EcoPlots, but that's probably another presentation in itself. Yes, and that concludes my presentation. But before any questions, I guess, when I spoke about the ESA research chapter vegetation classification group, We are quite an active group, and the ESA trying to promote the research chapter groups some more. They'll be promoting it more at the ESA in Melbourne this year. As I said, the group that I'm on, vegetation classification, it's quite active. We have Zoom meetings, quarterly. The next meeting is in a couple of weeks, and we'll be hearing from NVIS and their road mapping exercise and what that looks like, and also Alice, who's been doing some classification work over on the Tiwi Islands. She'll be presenting her work in that forum as well. So if you're keen to join that group with like-minded vegetation classification scientists, come and see me and I can add you to that list. Yes, and that's probably all I need to say. If there's any questions, happy to answer them.
We can start it.
Yes,
that was great for a non-vegetation person. That was fantastic. Point of history: why is the NT so well served with plot-based data?
It's a very good question. And look, maybe it's a result of NTVSD is a corporate system for all of our vegetation plots. So not just plots that were sampled for vegetation mapping, but it also includes all of our plots that inform the fauna surveys from all of the herbarium surveys as well. And I think the NT is quite unique in that sense, that we've been able to compile all that data in one corporate system. Whereas in Queensland, their data set from QBIS, that's all really based on for mapping for regional ecosystems. They probably do have other data sets with vegetation data available for different purposes. So I think that's probably, what do you think, Dom and Bridie? I think that would be a...
Yeah, I think because we're a smaller operational base, it's easy to bring it all together.
Yeah.
And most of the work for assessment has been done through the government. And so with the initiative, people like Donna and the others, that's been database over the years. So whereas in places like WA, it sort of hasn't been collected into one place. Yeah, it's just one of those legacy issues. Depends who's in the job at the time and what the projects are going on, and if somebody has that big initiative.
Was the CRC for tropical savannas part of that, do you think?
There still are data sets that aren't in there. So when the vegetation site database was built, it was built in a way that could also accommodate for consultant data as well. But I think there's that disconnect. Brian, you might want to step in here too, or Tim. There was that disconnect with actually obtaining that data through permits and actually getting it into our system from consultants. Some consultant data is in there, mainly point source data for threatened species assessments, but certainly not plot-based data.
It's still something that we're working towards, and part of it is, the work unifying the different data collections into one system was done actually quite a long time ago now, so it's quite unique at the time, but the technology to actually enable those kind of uploads of external data was quite challenging, you can say, Donna.
Yes.
So we're still looking at right in the future building better capability to sort of have that seamless upload.
The consultants use the same plot thing as well. The herbarium's got their standard feature, right? Consultants don't necessarily use that.
Yeah.
Really, I think a lot of those plot-based things though, and I noticed you didn't mention the Wilson mapping, like the entire NT mapping has been, and a lot of that was off that plot-based. When you mentioned the state and
absolutely, yeah.
So,
I didn't mention, so yes, so that was based on, so the Wilson et al. 1990, that was based off about 2,000 plots. I've got that in another presentation, but I sort of had to so that was based on about 2,000 plots. I presented that in Darwin actually a couple of years ago on how many plots that was based on. That was 1 to 1 million mapping. And they did come up with, you know, veg types for that mapping, and they also came up with definitive vegetation types as well. But I didn't delve into that in this presentation, because that's probably another presentation in itself.
Is that not included in the Foxhead L?
The Foxhead L is based on broad vegetation groups. So that's another thing that would be really interesting to do with these macro groups, is crosswalking it to the Foxhead L mapping as well. Because with the Foxhead L, with the broad vegetation groups, it does have some floristics like dominant species and then structural information, but it doesn't have like a full floristic composition of what's actually occurs in each. And that's why, you know, when I say Australian vegetation types, our classification systems are so heavily weighted on structure and not floristic composition. And that's where this eco-veg approach, I think, is somewhere where we need to go. And we've got so much plot data that we need to leverage on it and use it right across the continent and come up with a whole listing of macro groups for Australia as our framework. And then from that, we can keep classifying right down to the association level. Tim?
Yeah, so no, that's a raised issue, but you know, where the rubber hits the road on this is vegetation groupings as surrogates for ecosystems.
Yes.
And change and extent being the measure or whatever. It seems like there's, well, is the end game sort of pushing those two general approaches as far as ecosystem function and vegetation floristics into a single one framework fits all, or is it still trying to keep them separate?
And I think this is what NBIS is not struggling with, but there has been conversations within NBIS. And that's why with the IVC, the International Veg Classification, and the GET, so IVC is heavily weighted on growth form, bring up that diagram, and the GET is ecosystem. So they've tried to align them at those higher levels. So yeah, I think that has been raised at the ESA Research Chapter Group as well, that distinguishing ecosystems and vegetation types, because you've got all of those ecosystem drivers to,
Yeah, so but there's not a clear end game yet.
No. And I mean, Dom, you're probably dealing with this as you're developing the mapping for the NT as well. Sorry, Alan, you've had your hand sticking up for a long time.
Okay. So I've got a comment and then a question about the issue of annual grass versus perennial grass dominance in tetradonta. So my comment is that you described that vegetation type from the international classification as, I think you said, as pyrrhic tussock grassland, when of course, as we know, much of it is not tussock grassland, it's an annual system. So that reflects the fact that we are such a global anomaly in having. Anyway, so I'm not sure how you deal with that.
Absolutely. So this has been raised numerous times with the IV during that formation review with the GET and the IVC. I wasn't in any of those meetings. The Australian representatives were David Keith and John Hunter, I believe. So, but I get where you're coming from. Like with that alliance level, there would be tetradonta that would fall out with your perennials, with your annuals, and then with your dominant hummocks as well, because you do get eucalyptus tetradonta with a dominant hummock understory as well. So the way they've catered for it in the IVC, and let me see if I can go back to that slide, is they've created that savanna, and I'd have to go back in and have a look at the description in the GET typology for the pyrrhic versus the hummock to answer your question properly. Oh, here we are. Yeah, so they've actually had to incorporate even at this higher level here, because they had it shrub and herb vegetation, and it just didn't hit the mark for Australian vegetation types. Like we are, like you say, so unique, our vegetation. So that's why they did this review, to make sure at those higher levels, all the vegetation types were, you know, catered accommodated for, if you like. So they created this grassland, savanna, shrubland class, and then within that, the tropical grassland, savanna biome and subclass there, which aligns with the savanna and grasslands biome. And then as you come down here, yeah, that's probably what the point you're making here with the pyrrhic savannas and the hummock savannas. You'd probably get some of the tetradonta communities falling into this. And then the other tussock grasses with your annuals and your perennials into this one here.
So that was my comment.
Yeah.
My question is about the extent of floristic distinction between annual sorghum dominated versus perennial dominated, because I noticed you did have a different classification at some level down here, different. But looking at your characteristic species of the different groups we went through, I couldn't see any of the annual sorghum coming out there at all. And I just, so that's my question. What is the floristic distinction?
Yeah, so that would probably fall out. And I did ask Don Faber, who manages the IBC, I did ask him, what is your criteria to differentiate an alliance, an association, a group, a division? Like, what level of data do you need to make that distinction? So I'm imagining at the alliance level or the association level, that's when that would split out, where you'd have your dominant tetradonta with your annual sorghum, and then another one with your perennials.
Yeah, so I guess that's my distinction, is how, my question is how distinct floristically, I mean, obviously it is structurally, but floristically, how distinct annual sorghum dominated plots versus perennial dominated plots?
Well,
are they really distinct?
Well, we would need to, this is where I'd like to, with the NT macro groups, I'd like to refine that even further and see where it falls out, if there is a distinction.
They would fall out.
They would fall out.
You think so?
Yeah, we would think so, definitely. At the association level, which is the most detailed resolution of the hierarchy. Yeah.
So the lower levels are informed by the plot data, so they would fall out, because if they're not, then the plot data is instance data.
Yeah.
So it is dependent on the plot data and the species that you're retaining, the level of importance of how quantitative. And the top levels, they're a bottom down sort of, a top down sort of approach. So the two sort of come together, and that's sort of where Donna and the chapter and all this work is about, is bringing those two together. Yeah. So there is a point where it will be dominated by the dominant sort of stratum species, and you'll lose that sort of annual perennial influence on the distinction, but that would be at the higher level.
This is where I'm trying to encourage
functional type.
Yeah.
They're trying to look at, well, my interpretation is they're using functionality of systems as a way of not being a direct, well, IBC is vegetation classification, but if you step out of that and get more into an ecosystem view on things, they're trying to incorporate the function of the systems. So if they're functionally different, then how is that expressed in their vegetation? So that's where the work sort of.
So really, I think the first step is developing that framework at that macro group level, and then refining the analysis further. But I think this is where we need a biome approach to cut down those border effects, rather than doing a classification like an analysis for the NT like we've done. We just did that as a pilot because, you know, we had access to NT data and it was all curated and nice, but yeah, pulling data from across the different jurisdictions is a bit more challenging, and the curation of that data. But I think we need to approach it from the biome approach, and that's why we decided to use the tropical savanna as a bit of a case study. But we do have someone that's interested in refining that analysis and starting to bring in more environmental aids.
That's part of the work we're doing now. We're looking at revising the classification for our regional ecosystems in the Northern Territory, and that we're hoping will align. Well, we're working with either and to line up with Queensland.
Yeah.
But we're hoping to integrate more of the landscape and environment.
Yeah. It'd be neat to do, and this is where I was talking to John, if John's online. Talking to John about with the NT macro groups is refining that analysis using quantitative data, but just picking one or two macro groups. So one from the top end, and then one from the arid zone, and running that numerical classification down to the alliance association level and see what other communities fall out within that broader macro group. So that would be a neat, and that's where we would see if those the annual soil and perennial, what level that falls out at. Yes, Tim.
Given that I'm interested in water, is the Melaleuca group likely to be a good indication of where you've got water at the surface or close to the surface?
Potentially, yes. Yeah,
I do like to have wet feet.
So it's using, you know, species as an indicator of, I mean, certainly when I've been out on particular field trips, if you see, you know, Melaleuca or, you know, Corymbia polycarpa, you sort of get a bit of an indication that, you know, the soil and whether it's imperfectly drained or poorly drained. So I guess you could use that as a bit of an indicator. Definitely, yeah. But there was another group that fell out in that Northern Territory macro group classification. There was that broad macro group had all the Melaleuca, it had all your alluvial plains, your riparian systems, it even had your sand sheet vegetation from, you know, the Darwin rural area. That all was in that broader macro group. And then if we did further analysis of that, you'd find that things that just fall out at the different levels, but using quantitative data rather than presence absence. Yeah. But we do need some, you know, this sort of work needs to be supported and ongoing support. But anyway, we'll keep providing these case studies and hopefully it'll get some legs. So, Stephen.
Obviously, I'm not an expert at all in that, so my view will be very naive and probably provocative. I struggle to see how the data really clusters into these clusters. I mean, you showed only one view into the data, and it might look different in different views. So there's a lot of overlap between the clusters. I can't. Well, in that view, I couldn't really see any boundaries, so yeah. I'm struggling.
And there's not going to be hard boundaries.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the question is, are these 4 clusters, 3 or 5?
Yeah.
So I'm wondering whether the whole classification idea, at least to some extent, is probably not, where you have hard boundaries, is probably not the right approach. And you rather should have some variables that are continuing describing
and that's why we want to trial some other tests as well. I know that Mark Tozer in New South Wales has been doing some cluster analysis and he's been doing some different approaches on some of their subtropical rainforests. And I'm hoping to get him onto the ESA. He's on the ESA research chapter group and he'll be presenting at some point, but he did have some insights into that as well. So it's not a hard.
And I think also with the annual perennial thing, that's probably also not such a hard boundary.
I mean, it's hard to have hard boundaries in ecology, like nothing black and white, there's so many grey areas.
But the question is, do we have to think differently and move a bit away from that hard classification?
There's always going to be those transition zones. And I mean, certainly with mapping, we try and map hard boundaries by drawing polygons, but you've got those transition zones, and that's where sometimes they're mapped as mosaics because it's not a pure.
Yeah. And I'm coming to the conclusion with even something as simple as burned, unburned doesn't really make sense if you look at it closer. It's scale dependent, but also how impacting. It's I guess nature is not sort of classed in hard class. It's a continuum.
No, but like you said, a different approach. Yeah. And it depends on what clustering algorithm you use as well.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, the clustering algorithms that we use here, like K-means, is probably the most you know, your simple clustering algorithm.
But you need to tell it how many classes.
Well, that's right, you do.
Oh.
And so I think it's the same with UPGMA as well. So it has that, yeah, so we do, that's why I'm saying this is our the preliminary results as a matter of, you know, presenting something, but then we need to refine it and work out what sort of algorithms are suited to this.
There is ways of determining the optimal cluster.
Yes.
Information criteria and things like that. But it seems like there's three things that need to be done, and you sort of touched on a couple. One is it was done at different spatial scales. So if you did the analysis, because there's so many sites that if we did it at a 10K grid versus a 1K, but, you know, and just see, do you get the same clustering? Second, that environmental / seasonal thing, if you look, because there's especially got repeat plots where, you know, if you subset by time of year and wet years versus dry years, or even something simple like that, just so you get the same results.
Yeah.
And the third, I think, more useful way is what you're calling expert elicitation, where if you had experts start the process saying, these are what the science says are the drivers of vegetation structure and function, and do the analysis, you know, essentially testing that belief system and getting action, because I think you'll actually get rather than sort of throwing all the data out and say, you know, here's the patterns, that's the processes underlying it. Interesting things. So. But there's like a lot of data there to do that.
Oh, there's a lot of data, and it's like, how do we refine it? So that's why we're using the savanna as a bit of a test case. And then looking at these analyses by using K-means and UPGMA, but then looking at other tests as well. Like you said, Stefan, it does need improvement. But we'd like to continue with this analysis and get it right, so then we can apply it to data from across other biomes.
Yeah, just thinking about the classification versus continuous issue, and I'm just wondering if there's not an analogy with species, because we know plants often hybridize, very often hybridize, and it's a similar thing at boundaries, and you know, you get the fuzziness. It's a bit like happening here, but for the bulk of the population, they're pure. You know what I mean? I guess it's a similar thing for the bulk of the plots or whatever, it's pure, and it's just on the boundaries you get this fuzziness, and which doesn't mean the classification is not appropriate. It's just we would never do away with the species concept because there's some fuzziness on the boundaries. It's just recognising that on boundaries there's fuzziness.
There's fuzziness, exactly.
Most it's fine.
The only problem there is that boundaries, they are scale dependent, so you have to take scale into account.
Consideration,
I guess that's the beauty of plot-based data. You classify it into groups, and you've been a bit worried about where your boundary lies. You just look at your patterns from the data. Those data showed up there before, and you can say, well, it's extensive across this area. But if you read the papers on all this work, they do recognise that there's transitional groups as well. And when you do a classification, you will get plots that will fall out. You go, well, it's not really this one, not really this one. It's a transitional group. So,
and that's where the outliers, you know, removing those outliers, they would be those transitional.
On that transitional thing, has anyone ever used it? Just, I mean, this is going past classification into the actual mapping where you have the ability to highlight those areas, because often for fauna, for example, they prefer those sort of ecotone areas.
Yeah,
I guess you could
get higher diversity in those areas, can't you?
Yes.
Would we have a last question?
I don't know if I just missed. I don't know if I just missed it with the savanna. Was it just the savannas? Because obviously there's lots of rainforest patches and things through the top end of those areas. Were they some of those plots that were just excluded?
We excluded them, because that's been a separate classification in itself, so we excluded those plots, which I didn't make that clear. Sorry, that was part of the data curation exercise.
All right, so thank you, Donna. Thank you.
Thanks for you also for the interesting discussion. It's clear that we need to engage a lot of people and collaborate and bring things further, also in this changing world. And so we are happy to move to the real morning tea in yellow too, if you would like to join. And see you in 2 weeks.
Thanks, no worries. Don't worry. Sometime
yeah, but to simplify it, you've got to simplify stuff. That's the thing, isn't it? And I feel like,
yeah, sure. So thank you. Based in a place. It's related to TERN. So there's
that we're missing something when we.
Using both liner and across our that's on the card.
So instead of saying, yeah, I'm in a tetragrammaton of whatever, you could say, well, I'm in you give a figure. No, it gives you dimensions. I'm in the multi-dimensional space.
Yeah.